Hey folks, Steve here with another End of Empire video for you today. We are going to be looking at the War of Jenkin's Ear, 1740 to 1743. In the last video, which covered Queen Anne's War, I said we were going to do King George's War next, but technically, in terms of chronology, this is the next scenario. Now, this is one that is in the original game, so we aren't going to be using any material from the post-publication scenario PDF. We're not going to be using anything from Paper Wars 86. This is just a base game scenario, and it happens to be very small, both in terms of the number of units and the number of turns involved. So this is stuff that's all from the scenario book. I've got in pen some errata that I modify. I just marked in with pen. Let's talk about what the scenario is. So I'm going to just read from the scenario book. As in the Seven Years' War, the War of the Austrian Succession also saw fighting in the south, but this time it was between the British and the Spanish, and it was pretty much done before fighting began up north. That would be in 1744. The book doesn't say that. This is my little input there. Really a skirmish between Georgia and Florida. This conflict cannot be linked with the other scenario. The command structure did not exist. Only the southern map is used for the scenario, and it begins on turn 1, which is spring 1740, and ends after turn 19, spring 1743. The book notes that the scenario is quite small and suitable for beginners. Indeed. So a couple of things. I've got some weird stuff on the map. So this row of fortifications is not literally a row of fortifications. There's some special rules here, just like many of the scenarios have. But just to kind of throw out there what's on the board, we've got a South Carolina volunteer provincial unit here set up in Charleston. We have a Georgia militia in Savannah. And we've got in a whole stack here, there's a little bit of errata because the book as is says there's a few units in a hex for 3420, but apparently that is incorrect. They're all supposed to be in this this hex here, I guess. Even the Native American unit that says on the counter it should be back here, it's supposed to be here, I guess. So we have a regular regiment. We've got a ranger, and we've got two native allies here with a leader named Oglethorpe, which is fun to say. And then the opposing the British here are the Spanish over here in St. Augustine. And we have a militia, St. Augustine militia. We've got a regiment called the Naval Battalion that has artillery, which is interesting. We've not really, because of all the other scenarios that we've played, artillery's never really factored in because almost everywhere that we fought in the previous scenarios was in the wilderness. Artillery didn't matter. Well, now it matters. And we'll talk about that when it's relevant. We also have a guards unit. Maybe that's meant to be garrison. I forget how the game chooses to interpret some of these things. See if I can find a reference anywhere. It's probably in the rules. I assume G means guard. It might also mean garrison. I'll have to look at that. And then we've got another one of those. So we'll get it properly lined up here. So, yeah, militia, regular, whatever the G ends up being, and then the leader, whose name is Montiano. Now, if you're noticing something different with the counters, all the units in the game that are supposed to be set up for King George's War or this one have that little edge marking in the top right there, you see. So if you've got this game, you got a big pile of counters that aren't sorted. Any of the counters with that upper right symbol are related to either the War of Jenkin's Ear or King George's War. So just to help differentiate that, the French and Indian War scenarios have counters that are specially marked there as well. And I think the American Revolution counters don't have any sort of marking on them. So just to help in that. There are other native units that are available. The Spanish don't start with the Yamasee Indians, but they can recruit them on a die roll of 1 each turn. If for some reason the British lose these native allied units, they can be recruited from their villages. And then something that we haven't really dealt with, because this is the normal rule, but everything we've played up to this point has been special scenarios. All militia units are withdrawn at the end of every spring and fall turn. So it's something we're going to have to watch out for. I'm going to have to really make sure I remember to do that. So this militia and this militia will always go home in spring and fall to tend to crops and stuff like that. So, they don't necessarily what it functionally means is if that guy, if this guy marched far away, he's just going to go home. And he's not necessarily gone very long. He'll come back in the next turn. It's just it resets how far they can operate. It's functionally what that limitation is. It means they can only go so far before they got to go home. And then the South Carolina Volunteer Regiment here is going to be withdrawn every second winter turn in a given annual year. So when winter hits, that unit will be taken off the map and then will come back in the spring. So likewise, there's a limitation that, that unit is only going to be able to basically operate from spring till winter and then goes home, where any of these other regulars over here, the significance being like they're not going to go home. They're going to stay where they're at in winter, assuming they have a supply path, which means, they can be out farther and longer. That's the significant thing in this game system. And this will matter for other scenarios too, like the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, where those provincial units are really great. They always come back. They're useful, but you only get them for so many turns consecutively before you lose them. And then continental regulars or British regulars, wherever they're at, they're going to stay where they're at, and you'll continue to be able to operate them. Or, in a new campaign season, assuming they were in supply, they can continue going wherever you want them to go. And that's the real sort of operating difference between these different types of units. What are they really capable of achieving? Anyway, the victory conditions. The British player wins an immediate, decisive victory in the instant he controls St. Augustine. So this is sort of in the lower left here of your screen, the most important hex in the scenario. Otherwise, the player that controls the debatable land, Fort Simmons, which is right here, at the end of the game wins. So this is an outpost currently controlled by the British. The native recruitment is on die rolls of 1 when they're available. And there is a special Spanish restriction. So the Spanish may not enter the 41 hex row or hexes further north, as that was the limit of their territorial claims at the hex row 40. And I've noted that with these fortification markers. So that's what that means. These are not real fortification markers, but this is the limit that the Spanish can go if they manage to make their way up here, which means they can never attack Charleston effectively. So this is always some level of a safe haven for the British, any which way you want to look at it. The Spanish can never go that far. So the real operating area of the scenario is south of that, south being this way with the orientation of the map. The Spanish fleet does have naval infantry that could be used to do an attack along the coast or something, but the Spanish fleet, this is errata. That is not in the book by default. You got to look at the errata. The Spanish fleet is not available on turns 1 through 6. It will be available on a die roll of 1 on turns 7 through 19. And the British fleet does not appear to have a role in this scenario at all. So at least in terms of fleet interaction, the Spanish are going to have some advantage there. And then there's finally a little rule here about overseas supply. The Spanish may always use overseas supply. The British may also do overseas supply, except on turns when the Spanish fleet is in place. So the Spanish fleet is going to show up here in the South Atlantic and basically cut the ability to do overseas supply for the British. And that's going to be important if they're, whoops, sorry guys, I just kicked my camera stand. That's going to be important if they're far out along here and pressing on St. Augustine. So there's this time pressure to try to win the scenario quickly, because once the fleet is here, supply gets a little dicier. Now, besides overseas supply, the British are going to have access to some supply paths. So here in Savannah, there's a supply hex. You'll notice there's the American Revolution star circle there. In these types of scenarios, the British can use those supply sources, right? Because they're technically still crown lands for them. I don't know how you want to look at that. So that's a supply source. Savannah is, and so is Charleston for the British. So they'll be in supply over here. If there'll be supply along the coast if there is not the Spanish fleet here. And then if they are, they're going to be trying to count back to Savannah, usually if they're pushing on St. Augustine, and that could be tricky. Now, it's a 1 in 6 chance of the Spanish fleet later in the campaign, so it may be unlikely to be a major issue, but it does put a timer on the British in some ways. You'll also notice that because we don't have our bingo chits on the terrain here, that the map reflects what the map is, I guess. For the first time we've been playing this game on camera, we can simply take the map at face value, which means that these lighter white-ish colored, and there's a texture to these hexes, might be hard to see from where you guys are watching with the camera, but these are considered cultivated civilized hexes. And they're considered, the shade of color here, which is sort of a whiter color, denotes them as French or Spanish, civilized, friendly. And then this more sort of yellow color over here is American civilized, and in these scenarios means they're basically friendly to the British, essentially. And so the movement is different. So in the previous scenarios, we were having to spend 5 movement points for each wilderness hex moved, or 2 movement points alongside or along rivers, usually in the wilderness. Here, because we're dealing with civilized hexes, if it's a friendly civilized hex, then it costs just a single movement point. And if it is hostile but still civilized, then it's 2 movement points. And if you're moving along a river in civilized territory, regardless of its friendliness, it is 1 movement point. So the rivers won't really matter here because all the rivers are kind of running west to east. But say like this guy's going to move, well, he's going to get to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 5 to enter here is 15, 17, 19. So in one move, this guy can go all the way to here. And that's the significant difference that we're dealing with in this scenario and many of the scenarios to come that we've not done on camera, because these civilized hexes are just so much easier to traverse, and you can go much, much farther because of that, where if you're trudging around the wilderness, it takes a really long time. So while there's a little bit of wilderness out here, a lot of the maneuvering is going to be on the coast. It's going to be relatively quick, which means that this scenario could end very quickly if some decisive things occur. I think that's going to be the tricky bit here. Interesting. So yeah, a smaller scenario. The one thing I'm a little worried about with this one is the previous scenarios we played dealt with a pretty small number of units on the board, but you had a lot of turns to work with. So units that didn't activate would eventually activate and get to do something and impact the game situation. Here, it's a very small number of units, a very small number of stacks, and not that many turns. There are 19 turns in this scenario, and 19 can go by very, very fast here, and ultimately you could see some units not even activate. The leaders, the Spanish have a pretty decent leader. He's going to activate half the time. Oglethorpe has a 4, so he's going to activate pretty frequently, but whenever there's a stack without a leader, it's going to be really hard to get them moving here, and that could be a little anticlimactic if we get unlucky on the die rolls. The one thing to our benefit here is because we're on the south map, winter doesn't affect units the same way it does in the north, so there at least won't be winter penalties, I don't think, for these guys throughout the scenario. Okay, so what I'm going to do from here, again, because I think this is a relatively small scenario, I'm going to, off camera, play through, I think what I'll do is I'll play through a year, and we'll get to the spring of, I guess it would be 1741. So rather than skip 2 years, we'll skip 1 year and talk about how the campaign season went for this year in 1740, and go from there. Okay, so a quick check-in on the spring of 1741. So it was really interesting. So the Spanish basically could not move out of St. Augustine because they did not have, they basically, like, there's no point to even leave here and even think about taking this place unless you have a native ally with you. And it took basically until the winter to successfully recruit the Spanish allied Native Americans, and they are there now, but they weren't there for pretty much the whole campaign season, so opportunity lost. Oglethorpe did, with this unit with it at the time, make an attempt on St. Augustine, but what they had found was that with the units in the fort, and St. Augustine, if you go inside, you can always be in a fortification by special rule. It's got some marker on it. You can kind of see it. It's a bit faded there. Can go into a fort. And so the Spanish had done that. They were in the fort when Oglethorpe arrived, and I had looked at the combat results table and figured out, okay, Oglethorpe can never really take, at least not without maybe the militia to help change the odds ratio, can't really take St. Augustine. Just doesn't have the combat power to do it. What they could do is sit outside St. Augustine and kind of keep it besieged and sit on top of the stack with a fortification marker on it, and basically just sit there for the rest of the game until the turns are over and the British are in control of the debated land and win. And so what that did is that forced Montiano to attack out, sally forth, sortie out of the fortification at St. Augustine, and we had a combat. Now, what was interesting is that it was basically 7 combat factors on the attack versus 10 defense for the British. So it was 1 to 2 odds, but the Spanish have a +1 because they were fighting with, and now I've got to find the unit. This infantry has artillery. It's got that dot in the middle of the infantry symbol, which means it has artillery. And in civilized hexes or non-wilderness, if one side does not have artillery but the other does, that's a 1 die roll modifier in their favor. So on a 1 to 2 attack with a +1, the Spanish rolled a 6, which got turned into a 7 and actually defeated the British. Now the cost was that they lost a step, so we lost this guy, and the British chose to take it on. They took 2 losses. They took 1 on the enlisted, which we'll get back. They got back anyway, and then they took it off of did I forget to take another step loss? I wonder if I did. Oh no, I'm sorry, guys. I put it farther away. They basically got rid of the Highland regiment, so that was lost. And then from there, what else was interesting is that because we had the combat, I was rolling leader losses, which when your side takes step losses, you roll a die. I rolled fine for Oglethorpe, but I rolled a 1 for Montiano, and then I rolled again, and it was found that he was wounded and was put out of commission for 3 turns, was the die roll. So we are getting him back now this turn in spring of 1741. But without him, basically the Spanish could do nothing but kind of hold in place, and the British retreated back to here, where at least they left behind their native allies here. If you have 2 units stacked here with a +4 basically 4 attacking ambush factors, I don't even know how the Spanish can really realistically expect to get in here without being super duper lucky. Um, so maybe if we go in now that the Spanish have their native ally and we clear all the native allies, and then the Spanish win a subsequent combat, they could take it. But they don't get reinforcements. They don't get replacements either. So it's like I don't know if there is anything that the Spanish can do long term to keep the dream alive, but we'll see. We also rolled for the Spanish fleet because this is the first turn that the Spanish fleet could enter, and they did not enter. So, as it stands now, as we go into 1741, the actual campaign season for 1741, it is a question of can the Spanish do anything to get into here? That's the problem they need to solve. They were successfully able to do 2 step losses to the British. The first one they absorbed off that provincial, but the second one the Spanish player got to pick, and they picked a unit that could not be replaced. That's an important piece of errata that it came out for the rule book. The original rule book does not say that, but that's to help balance some things in the American Revolution, especially where if you can do 2 step losses to the British, you're almost certainly going to be able to do a step loss to the British regulars, and that's important for victory conditions. Here, it's simply for the balance of power. So right now, the British are feeling okay, and they can always replenish a certain amount of strength, but the Spanish have already lost one of their own units as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. So we'll come back in the spring of 1742 and see what else has happened. Okay, here we are in the spring of 1742, and there's certainly a lot more units in the dead pile. The we'll eventually have this militia back here, just not quite yet because they haven't come back in. But the Spanish marched up, then they had a way to turn, and then they attacked the British at the debated place after the British militia had to go home, and these provincials have been stuck in Charleston for a while. And in the combat, it was a super risky die roll. It was a 1-to-1 combat. The artillery didn't matter in the wilderness. The British natives had the ambush die roll, but they rolled a no result. And then in the linear combat, basically was a 1 attacker retreat, 1 step loss, attacker retreat, 1 defender loss. And so the British lost something here, and their native allies have scattered. The Spanish lost their allies, and they took a step loss, which came in the form of this naval regiment with artillery. And basically, they had to retreat and didn't have enough movement to try again. And so now we're kind of, trying to reset the blocks. And right now it'd be a very tight combat, but the Spanish are almost out of gas in terms of steps. The British just need to get their steps to the front, and then they're going to get another regiment reinforcement here very soon. So still haven't seen the Spanish fleet show up. If they ever do, that could be a very critical element here, but it's just not happened. So what I think I'll do from here is I'll play through the rest of the scenario. There's basically 1 full campaign season here for 1742, and then there's going to be a spring and a summer in 1743 before the scenario ends. Or I'm sorry, there's going to be a spring. The last turn is a spring turn. So we're going to have to see how that plays out, but since there's only a couple of campaign turns effectively, technically the winter is fine here, but it messes up the militia and the enlistments, which is a problem for the British. So we'll give it another playthrough here, and then this will probably end up being a pretty short video, a very small scenario, kind of swingy because there's only so many die rolls that are really going to matter here, but it's maybe a less interesting puzzle than the other scenarios, but interesting exercise nonetheless. Okay, here we are at the end of the scenario, and unfortunately for the Spanish, they nearly had it, only to be defeated at the end by the British, which really came down to activation die rolls at the end of all things, which is really kind of a shame. Um, one of those frustrating things. If you just can't activate, you can't just, you can't get to where you want to be. Um, so in the year of 1742, in the later part of the campaign season, the French, or I'm sorry, the Spanish fleet had shown up, and we did do a naval supporting attack. So the way that works is, and I had to go on Board Game Geek to kind of get some consensus from other people. You can go find those threads. Um, does does a combat here with the naval infantry? Can you just choose to say, "Hey, there's a combat in the coastal area. I'm just gonna flip my fleet and put it in without act. I don't need a roll for initiative. I just use it." And apparently, that's okay. You just, if there's a combat here, I can throw these guys in. And so the Spanish had done that, attacking the British that were fortified in the fort, the outpost in the Victory Hex, and the Spanish managed to win. And so they were occupying the area. Unfortunately, the remnants of Montiano's force there was pretty weak, and the British got fairly lucky in being able to activate some of the other units in the east that quickly traveled down the coast. The Spanish fleet was gone at that point and won a highly attritional combat that cleared the hex, and just the British managed to get back in there first and managed to get their native allies back on the board. There was a small amount of time where the the Yamasee were holding the hex and were hoping for the best, but they ended up failing in ambush, and then in linear combat they were defeated by the British. So it was really close. I think it could have gone either way, but those activation die rolls kind of get you. And I guess that's something that with this system, you're always kind of looking at. I'll show all the defeated and captured leaders over here in units and everything else that went on here. Kind of see the bloody affair. British always able to leverage these units that come back as cannon fodder in a lot of ways, which will come in handy for the Americans during the Revolution. Um, like that's kind of the tough luck factor of this game and system is the activation stuff. Um, and it's like any war game, right? If like the dice treat you wrong, the dice treat you wrong, and you only have the ability to control so much. Like I can complain about rolling crap and rolled in flames, but like yeah, that if both players are playing very well, what's going to decide the game might just end up being the dice, and that's outside of your control. But if it's a well fought game, that's okay. And I think in this scenario, for what scenario there is, how much content and volume there is in activity, it was tight. I mean, both sides had advantageous things they could do. If the Spanish fleet came in more than once, it could have been much harder for the British to come back. We might have been able to attack further up here and knocked out some of these regulars. What's really interesting, and I assume that this is correct, but I'm a little surprised. This unit, this Gren unit, is a reinforcement for King George's War on turn 14, apparently, due to errata. It's not in the scenario book. But he's also listed as a turn 14 reinforcement for the War of Jenkin's ear. And I don't, part of me wonders if there's something wrong with that, or if it's just like, no, he's turn 14 in both scenarios. But it feels like maybe there's something wrong there and something got put in the wrong space, and we just haven't gotten clarity on that. Because I could see this unit maybe have sort of been a factor in British victory, just because hey, it's another regiment that can operate well. So I might have to look at that, and see if there is some errata that I missed, that this guy is not supposed to be in this scenario and he's supposed to be in King George's War. I have that errata written in my scenario book, that he's supposed to be coming in on turn 14 in the King George's War scenario. But again, he's there in the text for this scenario as well, which just seems, it's it's coincidental maybe, and it's fine, and that's the way it's supposed to be. But I do wonder. Um, just we'll wrap this video up, talking about what I thought of this scenario specifically. Um, it's funny. I was a little, coming into it thinking, okay, you don't get as many turns. There's not very many units. So is this even as good as the Queen Anne or Queen William scenarios that we've already played? Because those scenarios give you a lot more time to work with. I think what helps down here is we are in the south map, which means winter is not as bad in terms of activating units. You still get plenty of activity across the 19 turns. Um, and, I think this is a good representative scenario of the system if you're playing this as just a brand new player and you're trying to figure out how to play the game, how the rules work. I mean, for me, it's interesting as part of the chronological journey that we're on, because you'd say, hey, look how, cultivated and settled North America is by the Europeans at this point. And now we're seeing, how the civilized terrain, uh, that's such a weird word, cultivated terrain, um, is uh, a highway. You're moving much faster along these settled areas because there's roads and all of that, and you can move much more quickly. That's an interesting dynamic, that if we're just playing purely from the perspective I'm playing through these scenarios, is a major change, and we'll continue to see that in the next few scenarios through to whenever we stop playing. But what's interesting with this scenario, I think, is, like, yes, the scenario book says this is quite small and suitable for beginners. I think this is suitable for beginners not just because it's small, but this scenario uh, represents a very good vertical slice of the game. Now, if you're not familiar with the term vertical slice, it's some jargon that gets thrown around that is meant to convey that while it is a smaller slice in terms of the content and volume of a product or a thing, the vertical slice hits all the different layers, so you get some experience with all the basic features of the thing. So here, what's interesting with this scenario is that you get a nice little mix of a lot of different things that are all represented, all these sort of important rules that are in the game that you should be, well versed in, are here. So the importance of uh, civilized terrain that is friendly or unfriendly to you versus wilderness, because the central hex is wilderness. The importance of the river for movement, because the native units that enter on their villages are going to get over here the most, more quickly based on the river movement speeds to get over here. So those things matter. You do see the importance of the ambush factor units in this wilderness hex to hold the victory hex, and the danger of proceeding without some kind of cover, which for the Spanish meant they needed to get their native allies on the board to have a better chance of coming into here. You see the importance of militia and enlistments and their reinforcement schedules for the withdrawals on spring and fall for the militia and winter for the enlisted provincials. You also see the importance of naval matters, and specifically how to do naval infantry support. There's the fort at St. Augustine and the fact that you can build a fortification in the outpost. These are all important game, mechanics, and that this scenario manages to bring them all in, as opposed to maybe, if you pick some other scenario where some of that stuff could be lost. Maybe the native element isn't as strong. Maybe the river element isn't as strong. It just shows a really nice slice. Now, By comparison, I think a lot of people probably uh, play the Invasion of Canada scenario first. That's in the scenario book, and I suspect the Invasion of Canada, just having looked at it and played around with it before, probably does similar things in being able to show that vertical slice, but it is a little bit larger, and I don't know. So I think there's something to this scenario, War of Jenkins' Ear, that it's the smallest of the sort of introductory scenarios that you could play in the base game. It serves as a vertical slice. The Invasion of Canada probably does too, but I could at least say for this one, it's definitely there. You probably get a little more naval stuff in this one, though it's not much, than you do in the Invasion of Canada scenario. So, um, yeah, it was an interesting little exercise. I mean, I think it was a little less, it was a little underwhelming compared to some of the other scenarios we played up to this point, obviously. But it was still its own interesting puzzle, like a lot of these scenarios that are small enough that, the die rolls tend to matter a little bit more. Um, that variance is really important because luck should sort of average out, and you need either a lot of turns to do it or a lot of units and a lot of leaders to balance the variance in that die roll for activation. Here you're a little constrained, but it still shook out as a pretty close game. The different advantages each side has, the asymmetry that's in this system, even though it's not always easy to see at first glance when you're playing a scenario, I think is interesting. So, and that managed to show itself well here. So there you go, guys. The War of Jenkins' Ear, 1740 to 1743. Now, for sure, the next video in this series for End of Empire will cover King George's War, 1744 to 1748, and I think we'll go from there. I might have to look around and make sure, are there any other oddball scenarios that I want to hit before we get into some of the bigger ones, but we'll look at that in time. So thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed watching this video. Hit like if you did, subscribe if you want to see more, all that good stuff. But until then, take care and keep on gaming.